There is a man who worked 40 years, saved with real discipline, and died with over $1 million still in the bank. To most people, that sounds like a win. Bill Perkins says it's a tragedy, because that $1 million was $1 million of experiences the man could have had and simply didn't. Trips not taken. Time with people he loved, traded for a bigger number he never got to spend. Perkins made his fortune trading energy, and his whole argument fits in one uncomfortable question. What if the real risk isn't running out of money, but running out of life with the money still sitting there? By the end of this, you'll have his actual formula for the one number that should scare you more than going broke. Because here's the thing he wants you to feel. You retire on your memories, not your money. Perkins learned this watching it happen to someone else. A close friend's husband, call him John, was 35, healthy, a lawyer with a young family. Then a routine scan found a tumor the size of a baseball, clear cell sarcoma. 3 months after the diagnosis, he was gone. In those final weeks, his wife quit her job, not to earn, but to be there, to soak up whatever time was left. What struck Perkins wasn't just the loss, it was how the nearness of death instantly reorganized their priorities. Suddenly, nobody cared about the promotion or the balance in the account. They cared about the hours. And Perkins realized most of us live as if that reckoning will never come, as if we have infinite tomorrows to finally start living. We don't. So the question becomes, if death is certain, why do we plan our money as though we're immortal? Perkins is an engineer by training, and he can't help seeing life as an optimization problem. The goal isn't to maximize the money you accumulate, it's to maximize the fulfillment you extract from a life that has a hard stop. And fulfillment has a cruel dependency. It needs both money and the health and time to use it. You can water ski, hike Machu Picchu, or dance until 3 a.m., but there's a window for each, and the window closes. A 25-year-old has time and health, but no money. A 75-year-old often has the money, but no longer the knees. The tragedy of a default life is that we pour our best years into filling the account and arrive at the money exactly when we've lost the ability to enjoy what it buys, which raises a strange possibility. Maybe the richest people are actually leaving the most on the table. Take that to its extreme. Perkins calls himself an honorary billionaire. He's been around real ones. And here's what he noticed. Even billionaires can't spend their money fast enough. The 2,000 richest households in America give away only about 1% of their wealth a year. Bill Gates has tried to give his fortune away and watched it double since 2010. If the richest people alive, actively trying, can't outspend their pile, what hope does a saver on autopilot have of ever using theirs? Perkins puts it bluntly, life is not a game of Space Invaders. You don't get points for all the money you rack up before the screen goes dark. And yet millions of us play it exactly that way, chasing a high score that, the moment we die, converts to precisely nothing. So where does that instinct to hoard even come from? For Perkins, it started with a boss. At 20-something, working the trading floor on an $18,000 salary, he was proudly saving about $1,000 of it. His mentor, Joe Farrell, looked at him like he was insane. Why are you saving money you'll never miss earning later? Economists have a name for what Farrell was getting at: consumption smoothing. The idea is to spread your spending across your whole life so no era is starved. But most of us do the opposite by accident. We rob our broke, energetic 25-year-old self to hand cash to our rich, tired 80-year-old self who has more than enough. You transfer money from the version of you who could squeeze the most joy from it to the version who can squeeze the least. Framed that way, oversaving isn't prudence. It's a bad trade you make with your own future, and it gets worse when you see what money actually costs you. Because money isn't wealth, it's stored life energy. Perkins borrows this from the classic Your Money or Your Life. Every dollar you have represents hours you traded away to earn it. So when you buy something, you're not really spending dollars, you're spending the hours of your life it took to make those dollars. That cheap impulse buy? Convert it to the treadmill time you ran to afford it, and it stops feeling cheap. But the same logic cuts the other way. And this is the part savers miss. Money you earn and never spend is life energy you burned for nothing at all. You did the hours, you paid the price, and then you let the reward evaporate. So the goal can't just be spend less. The goal is to make sure the life energy you cash in actually comes back to you as something worth having. And what's worth having, Perkins argues, isn't stuff. It's experiences. Your life, in the end, is quite literally the sum of your experiences. Everything you did, saw, felt, and shared. A bigger television fades into the background within weeks. But a trip, a wedding, a wild night, a hard climb, those don't just happen once and vanish. Perkins claims the best experiences are secretly an asset. You buy them once, and they keep paying you back for the rest of your life. He has a specific name for that payout, and it's the engine of this entire philosophy. Understand it, and you'll never look at a waste of money experience the same way again. So before we talk about spending down to zero, we have to answer the deceptively simple question underneath it. What exactly is an experience worth? Perkins answers with a regret of his own. When he was 20, his roommate Jason borrowed roughly $10,000 from a loan shark to backpack across Europe for 3 months. Perkins thought it was reckless and stayed home to keep working. Years later, at 30, with money in the bank, he finally took a similar trip. But now he was, in his words, too bougie for hostels, too set in his ways to travel like a broke 20-year-old. He'd missed the version of that trip that only exists when you're young and have nothing to lose. Jason, decades on, called his loan shark gamble priceless. And that's the trap. Perkins had all the good reasons. Be responsible. Wait until you can afford it. But some experiences have an expiration date that no amount of later money can reopen, which is exactly why when you spend matters as much as whether. Here's the image that cemented it for Perkins. His father, late in life and physically failing, lit up completely when Perkins put together a highlight reel of his dad's old college football games and handed it to him on an iPad. His father couldn't run anymore, couldn't play, but he could relive, and that reliving gave him some of his purest joy in those final years. That's when it clicked for Perkins. You retire on your memories, not your money. When your body finally can't do the things anymore, what you have left to draw down is the vault of experiences you banked. As the butler Carson says in Downton Abbey, the business of life is the acquisition of memories. In the end, that's all there is. So if memories are the currency of your final years, the smartest thing a young person can do is start minting them early. But how do you actually measure something as fuzzy as an experience? Perkins gets concrete about it. Imagine assigning every experience a rough number of fulfillment points. A quiet dinner might be worth a few, your wedding worth thousands. Now plot those points across the years of your life as bars on a chart, and the total area under that curve is your life's fulfillment. That reframe changes everything, because now the goal is visible. Don't maximize the money bar, maximize the area under the fulfillment curve. A life crammed with rich experiences at the right ages has a huge area. A life of relentless earning and deferred living has a tall stack of savings and a thin, starved curve. And the single biggest multiplier on that area isn't the experience itself. It's a hidden compounding effect most people never account for. This is the heart of the whole book, the memory dividend. When you have a great experience, you don't just enjoy it once. You replay it. You tell the story at dinner. You laugh about it with the same friends 20 years later. Each of those recollections delivers another hit of the original joy. A dividend paid out again and again for free for decades. So when you buy an experience, you're not buying a single moment. You're buying that moment plus the entire stream of dividends it will pay for the rest of your life. And it compounds hardest when it's shared, which is why Facebook can make money simply reminding you what you did on this day years ago. The lesson is almost violent in its implications. An experience at 20 pays out for 60 years. The same experience at 70 pays out for far fewer. So the earlier you invest, the richer the return. Perkins pushes the experience as investment idea one step further because it reframes what we call a good deal. He tells of a friend who bought a vacation property and defended it as smart. It would appreciate 3% a year. But Perkins asks the question we're trained not to ask. Forget the resale value. What's the return on experience? How much life, laughter, and memory did the place actually generate? We obsess over return on equity and treat return on experience as if it were free. Perkins flips it. The point of money is to buy experiences, and treating experiences merely as a route to more money gets the whole causality backwards. A house that appreciates but sits empty is a failed investment in the only currency that matters. So the real portfolio question isn't what will this be worth later? It's How much life will this buy me now while I can still spend it? And the timing of that investment is not a footnote. It's the whole game. Perkins hammers one instruction 3 times. Start early, start early, start early. Because of the memory dividend, an experience bought young has the longest possible tail of payouts. And here's the part that dismantles the "I can't afford it" excuse. Many of the richest experiences of youth are cheap or free. Sleeping on a beach, a road trip with friends, falling in love. These cost almost nothing but pay dividends for life. And they're precisely the ones we skip while telling ourselves we'll travel someday when there's money. Meanwhile, the small autopilot spending, the daily latte, the stuff we don't even notice, quietly drains the account with nothing to show. The fix isn't just to spend more, it's to spend deliberately, early, on the things that compound. Which brings us to Perkins' most provocative demand, the one in the title. Rule 3. Aim to die with 0. To understand why, meet John Arnold. Early in his career, Arnold told a colleague, "Once I make $15 million, if I'm still trading, punch me in the face." 15 million was his number, enough for any life he could imagine. Then he hit it, and he kept going. 25 million, 100. He built a fortune of over $4 billion before finally walking away at 38. And here's the confession that haunts the book. Arnold said he retired a few years too late. A man with $4 billion, one of the most successful traders alive, looked back and felt he'd spent too many of his irreplaceable years chasing a number he'd already blown past long ago. If that man overshot, what are the odds the rest of us, saving on instinct, are stopping anywhere near the right line? Most of us don't just overshoot a little. Perkins runs the math on a made-up but painfully ordinary worker. Call her Elizabeth. Steady job, sensible saver, does everything right. She dies at 85 with $130,000 still in the bank. Sounds fine. Until Perkins converts that leftover money back into life energy. At her wage, $130,000 represents 6,646 hours of work. That's more than 2.5 years of 50-hour weeks. 2.5 years of Elizabeth's one life, spent laboring for money she never once got to enjoy. She didn't leave a fortune. She donated years of her existence to a bank account. That's what playing it safe quietly costs. And it's not a personal quirk or a lack of discipline. It's a predictable pattern that a Nobel Prize-winning economist mapped out decades ago. His name was Franco Modigliani, and his life cycle hypothesis says something almost shocking in its simplicity. A rational person should spend down their wealth so that it declines to 0 by the date of death. Not near death, at death. Leaving money on the table is a mistake, because that money represents unused life. So the economics have said, aim for 0 for over half a century. And yet, virtually nobody does it. Studies show retirees barely touch their nest eggs. Many keep growing them into old age. So we have Nobel-grade math saying your wealth should end at 0, and human behavior clinging to every dollar until the grave. Why the gap? Why, when the smart answer is to spend it down, do we do the exact opposite? Perkins spends the rest of the book on that question, starting with the people who supposedly have the best excuse. But I love my job, they say. I'd work even if I didn't need the money. Perkins says, fantastic, keep working. Loving your work is a genuine experience worth having. But it doesn't exempt you from the rule. It just changes what you do with the money your work throws off. If you love the job for its own sake, then the salary is a byproduct. And a byproduct you never spend is still waste. Perkins uses a video game image. Money you'll never use is like collecting an extra life in a game you've already finished. It does nothing. So the I love my job crowd isn't off the hook. They still have to convert that surplus into experiences, gifts, and impact, or they're just a happier version of the same trap. But loving the work is the good reason. The bad reasons are far more common and far more expensive. And the data on those bad reasons is damning. Federal figures show most people's net worth keeps rising into their 70s, the exact decades they should be drawing it down. One major study found retirees with $500,000 or more spent barely 12% of it over 20 years. A third of retirees actually increased their assets. Perkins tells a small, devastating story. He once gave his grandmother $10,000, hoping she'd treat herself. The only thing that ever materialized was a $50 sweater. For him. The rest just sat there, unused, behind plastic-covered furniture. Our capacity to enjoy money drops as we age. The go-go years give way to slow-go, then no-go. But our spending doesn't fall nearly as fast as our health does. We die richer than we ever lived. And behind almost all of it sits one specific, powerful fear. The fear of running out, of being old, broke, and helpless, so we cling, just in case. Perkins doesn't dismiss the fear, he interrogates it. Some caution is rational, but much of it, he argues, is an abundance of caution, hoarding against catastrophes that money can't actually solve anyway. If you need $50,000 a night end-of-life care, no ordinary savings account was ever going to save you. That's what insurance is for, not a lifetime of self-denial. Guarding every dollar against a worst case you can't out, save is like buying insurance against an alien robot invasion. Perkins would rather live fully and, as he puts it, see you at the grave, than sacrifice his best years, squeezing out a few extra sick weeks at the very end. The fear is real, but feeding it with your whole life is a terrible deal. So how do you spend down safely without gambling on the date of your own death? Perkins is emphatic that die with zero is not spend recklessly and pray. It's a target you aim at with tools. The first tool is information. Instead of vaguely acting like you might live to 150, get an actual life expectancy estimate. Actuaries have free calculators for exactly this. Once you have a realistic number, you can separate two very different dangers. There's mortality risk, dying sooner than you planned with unspent money. And there's longevity risk, living longer than you planned and outliving your savings. Most people obsess over longevity risk and let it govern their entire financial life. But you can't manage a risk you refuse to estimate. Getting a number turns a bottomless, paralyzing fear into a solvable problem with edges. And once the problem has edges, there's an elegant financial instrument built to erase the scariest edge entirely. It's called an income annuity, and Perkins frames it as the mirror image of life insurance. Life insurance protects your family against you dying too soon. An annuity protects you against living too long. You hand an insurer a lump sum, and they guarantee a check every month for as long as you breathe. Put in, say, $500,000 at 60, and you might get around $2,400 a month for life, no matter how long that life runs. Now the fear of outliving your money is gone, insured away, which frees you to actually spend the rest. Perkins notes, this beats white-knuckling the famous 4% withdrawal rule, where you self-insure by underspending forever out of fear. His line, this is why you are not a good insurance agent. You're not built to price your own death. So stop trying and let a tool carry the risk you were carrying with your lifestyle. Even with the tools, Perkins knows the real obstacle is psychological. We are, he says, wired to be irrational about death, to spend absurd sums for a tiny, miserable extension at the very end, while refusing to spend on the vivid decades right in front of us. To fight that, he points to a blunt little trick, a countdown app. Not a to-do list, a timer counting down to a realistic estimate of the day you'll die. It sounds morbid. It's meant to, because a shrinking number of days on a screen does something a vague someday never can. It converts time from an assumption into a resource you can watch draining. Suddenly, a free Saturday isn't infinite. It's one of accountable, dwindling set. That urgency is the whole point. And once you feel it about your own life, Perkins turns it on the money you plan to leave behind. Which brings us to the objection everyone raises. I'm not saving for me. I'm saving for my kids. Perkins loves this objection because he thinks it's where people are most sincerely, expensively wrong. His first move is startling. The money you plan to leave your children is not your money. It's theirs. So the honest question isn't, how much do I sacrifice to leave them a pile? It's, how do I get their money to them at the moment it does the most good? And the moment I happen to die is almost never that moment. Because, as Perkins puts it, dead people can't give money away. By waiting until you're gone, you've surrendered all control over the two things that actually determine whether that gift changes a life: how much and, crucially, when. Look at what inheritance actually looks like when you leave it to death. Perkins calls it the 3 R's, a random amount at a random time to a person at a random age. And the timing is quietly disastrous. The most common age to receive an inheritance is around 60. Think about that. Your kids finally get your money when they themselves are nearly retired, long past the years when it could have paid off their house, funded their own young family's adventures, or bought them freedom in their 30s. A dollar to a 60-year-old who's already comfortable is worth a fraction of that same dollar to a 30-year-old drowning in a mortgage and hungry for the world. By defaulting to "when I die," you don't just risk giving the wrong amount, you almost guarantee giving it at the least useful moment of their lives. Perkins makes it real with a woman he calls Virginia. She raised 4 children largely in poverty, scraping through the hardest years with almost nothing. Then, at 49, she inherited about $130,000 when her mother died, money from an estate that had been sitting there the whole time. By then, her kids were grown and the desperate years were behind her. The inheritance was, in her words, merely a nice bonus. Imagine what that same money would have meant a decade or two earlier, in the thick of the struggle. Not a bonus, but a lifeline. Virginia saw it clearly, and it changed her. Now she gives to her own children early, while it can still bend the shape of their lives. She refuses to make them wait for her death to receive what was always meant for them, which raises the obvious question, if not whenever I die, then when? Perkins put the question to the internet. Thousands of votes on the ideal age to receive an inheritance, and the winner, by a wide margin, was the range 26 to 35. It makes intuitive sense. Much younger, and there's real risk the money gets squandered before there's judgment to use it. Much older, and you've missed the window where it does the heavy lifting, launching a career, a home, a family, the boldest adventures. 26 to 35 is the sweet spot, old enough not to blow it, young enough for it to change the trajectory. Perkins lives this himself. He's already handed his stepson the bulk of his inheritance, a house, at 29, rather than making him wait decades for it. The principle is simple, and it stings. Give your children their money when it can still author their story, not when it's just a footnote to yours. But Perkins is careful not to let this become purely about dollars, because he says your real legacy to your kids was never the money at all. It's the time. It's you. He invokes the old song, "Cats in the Cradle." The father, always too busy earning to be present, who looks up one day to find his son grown and just as distant. Research backs the intuition. A study of thousands of adults linked the warmth they got from their parents to better health decades later. Here's the brutal irony. Working ever harder to leave your kids a bigger inheritance can deplete the one inheritance they'll remember, your presence. You can grind yourself down building them a fortune and hand them a stranger who happened to pay for things. The money is real, but it is not the gift they'll grieve the absence of. And the same give it while it counts logic reaches beyond your family. It reaches charity, and here Perkins is at his sharpest because the numbers are stark. He contrasts 2 givers. Sylvia Bloom was a legal secretary who worked 67 years, lived in a rent-controlled apartment, and quietly amassed a fortune nobody knew about, donating $8.2 million at her death. Extraordinary. But Perkins asks the uncomfortable question, what if she'd given even part of it while she was alive to watch it work? Against that, he sets Chuck Feeney, who spent his life deliberately giving away more than $8 billion, giving while living, until his own net worth was down to a couple million. Feeney got to see the good his money did. Perkins' rule is unsentimental. By definition, you cannot be generous when you're dead. If you plan to give, give while you're alive, and the earlier, the better. Your charity, like your kids, cannot wait for your funeral. So far, this all points one direction. Spend, give, live now. But Perkins slams on the brakes because he's seen the overcorrection, and he's been it. After his boss shamed him for oversaving, Perkins swung wildly the other way, into what he admits was basically lighting money on fire. That's not the goal either. Rule 6 is don't live your life on autopilot, in either direction. Autopilot saving is the disease most people have, but autopilot spending is just a different way of not thinking. The real skill isn't spending more or less. It's spending deliberately, matching your money to your life so that every era gets what it actually needs. And that means confronting a comforting lie the personal finance world keeps selling us. The lie is the fixed rule. Save 20% every year. Follow the 50-30-20 split. Half your income to needs, 30% to wants, 20 to savings. These sound responsible, and Perkins says they're worse than useless because they ignore the one variable that changes everything: your age. The optimal balance between spending and saving is not a constant. it shifts across your life. A 25-year-old and a 55-year-old following the identical savings percentage are both making a mistake, just opposite ones. In fact, several sharp economists argue the young should often spend more and even borrow against their future, because their future selves will be richer and can spare it. A single fixed ratio applied to a life that is anything but fixed guarantees you starve some era to overfeed another. But to spend by age, you need to know something uncomfortable about how your ability to enjoy money actually behaves over time. And it behaves like a curve that peaks and falls. Perkins tells a story from a beach bar in the Caribbean where his girlfriend's grandfather, a former swim coach, sharp as ever at 69, waded out and nearly drowned in gentle water his younger body would have laughed at. Same man, same will. A body that could no longer cash the check. That's the pattern for all of us. Our capacity to enjoy what money buys rises in youth, peaks in midlife, then declines as health fades, no matter how fat the account. Money, Perkins says, is nearly worthless at the very beginning and the very end of life. Too little of it when young, too little health to use it when old. Picture two curves, your wealth rising, your health falling, and your real spendable life is the shrinking overlap between them. The whole art is spending into that overlap while it's still open, which means the true golden years are almost certainly earlier than you think. We're sold retirement at 65 as the reward, the moment we finally get to enjoy the money. But Perkins argues the peak of enjoyment, where health and wealth and free time overlap best, tends to arrive before 65, not after. The most fulfilling window for most people is somewhere in the middle of life, and that's exactly when we're heads down grinding and deferring. His radical prescription: deliberately move money backward in time. Take dollars you'd otherwise spend in your frail 80s, when you'll struggle to use them, and pull them into your vigorous 40s and 50s, when you can turn them into mountains climbed and memories minted. It feels irresponsible. It's the opposite. It's matching the resource to the window when the window is open. And there's one investment that widens the window itself. That investment is your health, and Perkins ranks it above money without hesitation, because no money can buy back a body you let go. He points to a man named Stephen Stern, unfit for years, who rebuilt himself into real strength in his 60s. Proof the decline isn't pure destiny. Perkins even bet a set of poker-playing brothers 50-1 on a body transformation. One lost over 100 pounds, the other gained more than 50. Both collecting on the wager. The lesson underneath the theatrics: health compounds exactly like money, in both directions. Small habits now, moving, lifting, not carrying extra weight your knees will pay for, buy you more years in that overlap where money is still enjoyable. Investing in health isn't vanity or a side quest. It's literally widening the window in which every other dollar can still be spent on a life, and time, like health, can be bought back too. Perkins wants you to stop underselling one specific resource: your hours. If you can pay to erase a chore you hate, the cleaning, the laundry, the commute you dread, and buy back that time for something that actually fulfills you, do it. Research finds that spending money to save time raises life satisfaction across income levels, and yet we resist it, treating our own hours as free. They are not free. They're the most finite thing you own. Refusing to outsource a miserable task to save money is often just another way of transferring life energy to a future that has plenty and starving a present that's desperate for time. The reframe is that money's highest use isn't always buying things or even experiences directly. Sometimes it's buying back the raw hours to have experiences. And how much a given hour or experience is worth to you turns out to depend heavily on one thing: your age. Perkins captures this with what he calls your personal interest rate and a game of would you rather? Would you rather have a great experience now or the same one delayed a year? A 20-year-old might happily wait for a modest sweetener. The experience will still land beautifully at 21. But offer that same delay to an 80-year-old and the price of waiting skyrockets. A year is a far bigger fraction of what's left, and their ability to enjoy it may be gone entirely. So the interest rate someone should demand to postpone an experience rises with age. It's the famous marshmallow test in reverse. Waiting is wisdom when you have decades of health ahead to collect, and folly when you don't. The older you get, the less you should defer, because delay isn't patience anymore, it's risk. And that reframe of time as a depreciating asset leads to Perkins' most practical planning tool: He calls it thinking in seasons, and it starts by dismantling a comfortable illusion. We picture one death at the very end and assume everything's available until then. But Perkins says we die a multitude of deaths along the way. The last time you'll ever pick up your child, the last powder day on skis, the final long backpacking trip your body will allow. Each is a small death of a possibility, and it happens long before your heart stops. He uses the image of swimming pools. As a kid, you're in the kiddie pool, then the teen pool, then the adult pool, and you can't go back. The day you die is not the day you lose the ability to do something. That day usually comes years earlier, quietly, unmarked. Recognizing those smaller endings is what turns someday into this decade or never. So Perkins hands you a way to see them coming. Before the tool, one more jolt of urgency from people who ran out of time. A palliative care nurse named Bronnie Ware spent years with the dying and collected their biggest regrets. Near the very top, "I wish I hadn't worked so hard." Notice what nobody on a deathbed says. Nobody wishes they'd spent more time at the office or grown their net worth a little larger. The regrets are always about the living they postponed, the dreams deferred, the relationships neglected, the courage never summoned. Perkins isn't using this to be maudlin. He's using it as data, a preview of the audit you will one day run on your own life. Told by people already at the finish line. Their verdict is unanimous. The unlived experiences hurt far more than the unearned dollars ever could. So the practical question is how to make sure your list gets lived. That's where time bucketing comes in. Here's the tool. Draw a timeline of your life from now to a realistic end. Divide it into chunks, 5 or 10-year buckets. Now take every experience you want to have, and instead of dumping it on a vague bucket list, drop each one into the specific bucket where it actually belongs. The age at which your health, money, and life stage best support it. Skydiving and backpacking go in the earlier buckets. Slower travel and time with grandkids might go later. Do this, and something powerful happens. You see, in black and white, that some dreams have a deadline, a bucket after which they're simply no longer realistic. And Perkins is quick to add, don't overfence yourself. A woman named Catherine Beers ran the Boston Marathon at 85. The buckets aren't a cage. They're a map of which windows are closing first, so you fill those before they shut. The difference between this and a normal bucket list is everything. A bucket list is reactive, a panicked scramble late in life to cram in everything you deferred, often after your body has already voted no. Time bucketing is proactive. It spreads your experiences across your whole life, weighted toward the years you can most fully enjoy them, which, Perkins notes, tends to cluster in your youth and midlife, not the far end. You stop treating living as a reward you unlock after decades of grinding, and start treating it as something you schedule deliberately, now, in the right seasons. It's the same shift the whole book keeps making, from drifting on autopilot towards some distant mythical payoff, to steering on purpose through a life you can actually see the shape of. And Perkins has lived this at full volume, in a way that makes most planning advice look timid. For his 45th birthday, Perkins spent lavishly, flew friends to a Caribbean island, rented out a hotel, brought in live music, threw the kind of party most people would call financially insane. He has zero regrets. And the reason why is the gut punch of the chapter. Within a few years of that party, his father had died and his mother's health had sharply declined. The window in which those particular people could gather and celebrate like that was already closing, and he didn't know exactly when. Nobody ever does. Had he been responsible and postponed the celebration to some richer, safer future, that future never arrived intact. The lesson isn't throw expensive parties. It's that the people and the health that make an experience possible are on a countdown you can't see, which forces the hardest financial question in the book. If you're supposed to spend down to zero, when do you actually stop piling up money? Perkins' answer overturns how we all think about it. Your net worth peak, the moment you stop growing your wealth and start spending it down, should not be a number. It should be a date. Chase a number, and you'll never feel safe. 2 million becomes the new target, then 3, then 5. Enough recedes forever, and you die on the treadmill still climbing. But if your goal is to die with zero, your wealth has to peak and then decline. That peak is a moment in time tied to your age and health, not a figure on a statement. Perkins drives it home with a plain observation. He has never once seen a person's net worth engraved on their tombstone. Nobody is remembered for their peak balance. So the real task isn't hitting a magic number. It's finding the point in your life where continuing to accumulate starts costing more life than it's worth. And now, the number I promised at the start. The one Perkins says should scare you more than going broke. He gives an actual formula for your survival threshold, the floor you genuinely need, below which caution is rational and above which it's just fear. Take your cost to live 1 year, multiply it by the number of years you expect to live, and multiply that by roughly 0.7 because your investments keep earning, so you don't need every dollar up front. In his worked example, $12,000 a year over 25 years doesn't require $300,000 in cash. With modest growth, it's closer to $213,000. That's your real floor. Everything you pile up beyond that threshold and never spend is the scary number. It's pure, unlived life. The fear was never, what if I run out? It should be, what if I die with all of this still here? So when does that peak, that stop accumulating date, usually land? For most people, Perkins says, somewhere in the window of 45 to 60. That's often when you've cleared your survival threshold with room to spare, and when your health is still good enough to spend boldly. But he adds a vital caveat. Use your biological age, not just the calendar. Two 60-year-olds can be a decade apart in real vitality. One's window is wide open, the other's is closing fast. And the world may not let you choose your own date. A lot of retirements are involuntary, forced by layoffs or health long before people planned. All of which argues for the same thing. Don't drift toward a vague, someday I'll slow down. Estimate your peak deliberately, tie it to your body and your threshold, and be ready to flip from accumulating to spending before life flips the switch for you. Even here, the die-hard workers push back one more time. But I genuinely love my job. I don't want to stop at 55. And Perkins again says, then don't stop. But you must still ramp up the spending. He tells of a friend, an entrepreneur, mid-50s, plenty saved, whom Perkins literally challenged to go spend $300,000 on pure enjoyment because the man simply wasn't converting his surplus into life. Keeping the job you love is fine. Hoarding the money it produces is not. Another sharp mind Perkins cites frames the trap perfectly. People will splurge on a first-class seat, but agonize over a $300 meal with no coherent logic to it. The point is to become deliberate about the surplus, to actively, even uncomfortably spend it into experiences, rather than let "I love working" quietly become one more permission slip to die rich and unlived. Perkins is honest that this is hard, genuinely, psychologically hard. After a lifetime of being praised for saving, decumulating, watching the balance you built with such pride deliberately go down feels like failure at a bone-deep level. But that discomfort is the tax on doing it right. And the tool for pushing through is the one from earlier. Rebucket your life. Every 5 or 10 years, redraw the timeline, reassess which windows are still open, and consciously shift more spending into your remaining golden years. Perkins keeps investing in his own health, pointing to his sister, still building strength in her late 50s, precisely to keep those windows open longer. The mindset shift is from a lifetime of grow the number to a disciplined, deliberate spend it down into a life, which leaves one last obstacle standing between you and all of this. And it's not money at all. It's nerve. Rule 9. Take your biggest risks when you have the least to lose. Perkins points to Mark Cuban, who as a young man with nothing sold trash bags door to door, drove a beat-up car to a new city and swung at every opportunity because, in Cuban's own words, he had nothing to lose. That's the hidden logic of risk. It's asymmetric across your life. When you're young, little money, few dependents, decades to recover, the downside of a bold bet is small and the upside is enormous. A failed gamble at 25 is a story you tell later. The same failure at 55 can be genuinely ruinous. So the time to be boldest is exactly the time we're usually most timid, clutching an entry-level salary and playing not to lose. Perkins wants you to invert it. When the stakes are low and the runway is long, that is when you should be swinging hardest. He's lived it. Fired at 23, Perkins bounced back easily, because at 23, there was almost nothing to bounce back from. He took a wild shot at becoming a trader in a new city with no safety net, and it built his entire fortune. He tells of a former child actor, Chunk, from the Goonies, who reinvented himself as a lawyer and of a woman named Christine who quit a soul-crushing job at 25 with no backup plan and never regretted it. Perkins even gives you a way to quantify the fear. If you're afraid to move away from loved ones for a great opportunity, calculate the real cost. Often, it's just the price of a plane ticket home a few times a year to keep those bonds alive. Name the actual downside, and it usually shrinks to something laughably survivable. The fear feels huge. The math almost never agrees. But boldness isn't only for the young, and this is where Perkins lands. For an older person, the biggest risk isn't a bad investment. It's inaction, clinging so tightly to security that you let the last good years slip past unspent. It takes real courage to look at your careful pile and choose to spend it on living, to trust the floor is enough, and step off the treadmill. Perkins puts the whole book in one line. People are more afraid of running out of money than of wasting their life. And that has got to switch. He'll admit you'll never hit exactly zero. That's impossible. But aiming for it drags you off autopilot toward a life actually lived. Because when it's over, the account resets to nothing anyway. And all you keep is what you felt and gave and did. You retire on your memories, not your money. So what are you waiting for?